Introduction. Throughout my childhood, the term genius was a constant, looming presence in our household. It was always my father who invoked it, often declaring without any provocation or context that I simply did not possess that elusive quality. He might announce this verdict during a casual family dinner, in the lull of a television commercial, or while relaxing with his newspaper. I cannot recall exactly how I reacted in those moments. Perhaps I chose to ignore it, but his fixation on high intellect was undeniable. He frequently worried about the relative intelligence of our family, fearing that our lack of Einsteinian brilliance would inevitably cap our potential and limit our achievements. This skepticism wasn't reserved solely for me. He held the same doubts about my brother and sister. In his estimation, none of us measured up to the titans of intellect, and this was a source of profound disappointment to him. In a twist of deep irony, I was recently honored with a MacArthur Fellowship, an award colloquially and famously known as the Genius Grant. This is not an honor one applies for, nor one that friends can lobby for on your behalf. It is bestowed by a secretive committee of experts who identify work they deem critical and creative. When the call came, my initial reaction was a wave of gratitude and shock. But almost immediately, my mind drifted back to my father and his lifelong assessment of my potential. He was not incorrect. I did not receive this award because I possess an intellect far superior to my colleagues in psychology. My father had, in essence, arrived at the correct conclusion, that I was not a genius, but he had been asking entirely the wrong question. During the month of secrecy before the award was made public, I had time to reflect on the strange symmetry of the situation. A girl who had been repeatedly told she lacked genius had been awarded for being one, yet the award was given not for innate talent, but because I had uncovered a fundamental truth, that what we achieve in life is often determined less by raw intelligence and more by passion and perseverance. I was not a child prodigy. I did not qualify for gifted programs in elementary school. I do not play the piano or violin with virtuosity. My path was not paved with the easy successes of the naturally gifted. When the news finally broke, I went to see my parents. They had already heard, and the phone was ringing off the hook with congratulations. When the noise settled, my father looked at me and simply said he was proud. I accepted his pride without reopening old wounds, but a part of me wished I could travel back in time to speak to the young girl I once was, and to the father who doubted her. I would tell him that he was right about my lack of genius, but wrong about its necessity. I would tell him that I would grow up to love my work with a ferocity that matched his own. I would tell him that I would view my work not just as a job, but as a calling. I would promise him that I would challenge myself daily, that I would rise every time I fell, and that while I might not be the smartest person in the room, I would strive to be the most tenacious. I would tell him that, in the long marathon of life, grit matters more than talent. Years later, I now have the scientific data to support that declaration. I know that this quality, grit, is not a fixed trait, but something that can be cultivated and grown. This book is the summation of everything I have learned about that power. When the manuscript was complete, I returned to my father. He has been battling Parkinson's disease, and his cognition is not what it once was. Yet, as I read the book to him, chapter by chapter over the course of several days, he seemed to listen with intent. When I finished the final line, he looked at me. After a long silence, he gave a single nod, and then he smiled. Book 1, Chapter. By the time you set foot on the campus of the United States Military Academy at West Point, you've earned it. The admissions process for West Point is at least as rigorous as for the most selective universities. Top scores on the SAT or ACT and outstanding high school grades are a must. But when you apply to Harvard, you don't need to start your application in the 11th grade, and you don't need to secure a nomination from a member of Congress, a senator, or the Vice President of the United States. You don't, for that matter, have to get superlative marks in a fitness assessment that includes running, push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups. Each year, in their junior year of high school, more than 14,000 applicants begin the admissions process. This pool is winnowed to just 4,000 who succeed in getting the required nomination. Slightly more than half of those applicants, about 2,500, meet West Point's rigorous academic and physical standards, and from that select group, just 1,200 are admitted and enrolled. Nearly all the men and women who come to West Point were varsity athletes. Most were team captains, and yet 1 in 5 cadets will drop out before graduation. What's more remarkable is that, historically, a substantial fraction of dropouts leave in their very first summer during an intensive 7-week training program named, even in official literature, Beast Barracks. Or, for short, just Beast. Who spends 2 years trying to get into a place and then drops out in the first 2 months? Then again, these are no ordinary months. Beast is described in the West Point Handbook for New Cadets as the most physically and emotionally demanding part of your 4 years at West Point, designed to help you make the transition from new cadet to soldier. A typical day at Beast Barracks begins at 5 a.m. By 5:30, cadets are in formation, standing at attention, honoring the raising of the United States flag. Then follows a hard workout, running or calisthenics, followed by a non-stop rotation of marching in formation, classroom instruction, weapons training, and athletics. Lights Out to a melancholy bugle song called Taps occurs at 10 p.m. and on the next day, the routine starts over again. Oh, and there are no weekends, no breaks other than meals, and virtually no contact with family and friends outside of West Point. One cadet's description of Beast: you are challenged in a variety of ways in every developmental area, mentally, physically, militarily, and socially. The system will find your weaknesses. But that's the point. West Point toughens you. So, who makes it through Beast? It was 2004 and my second year of graduate school in psychology when I set about answering that question, but for decades, the U.S. Army has been asking the same thing. In fact, it was in 1955, almost 50 years before I began working on this puzzle, that a young psychologist named Jerry Kagan was drafted into the Army, ordered to report to West Point, and assigned to test new cadets for the purpose of identifying who would stay and who would leave. As fate would have it, Jerry was not only the first psychologist to study dropping out at West Point, he was also the first psychologist I met in college. I ended up working part-time in his lab for 2 years. Jerry described early efforts to separate the wheat from the chaff at West Point as dramatically unsuccessful. He recalled in particular spending hundreds of hours showing cadets cards printed with pictures and asking the young men to make up stories to fit them. This test was meant to unearth deep-seated, unconscious motives, and the general idea was that cadets who visualized noble deeds and courageous accomplishments should be the ones who would graduate instead of dropping out. Like a lot of ideas that sound good in principle, this one didn't work so well in practice. The stories the cadets told were colorful and fun to listen to, but they had absolutely nothing to do with decisions the cadets made in their actual lives. Since then, several more generations of psychologists devoted themselves to the attrition issue, but not one researcher could say with much certainty why some of the most promising cadets routinely quit when their training had just begun. Soon after learning about Beast, I found my way to the office of Mike Matthews, a military psychologist who's been a West Point faculty member for years. Mike explained that the West Point admissions process successfully identified men and women who had the potential to thrive there. In particular, admissions staff calculate for each applicant something called the whole candidate score, a weighted average of SAT or ACT exam scores, high school rank adjusted for the number of students in the applicant's graduating class, expert appraisals of leadership potential, and performance on objective measures of physical fitness. You can think of the whole candidate score as West Point's best guess at how much talent applicants have for the diverse rigors of its 4-year program. In other words, it's an estimate of how easily cadets will master the many skills required of a military leader. The whole candidate score is the single most important factor in West Point admissions, and yet it didn't reliably predict who would make it through Beast. In fact, cadets with the highest whole candidate scores were just as likely to drop out as those with the lowest. And this was why Mike's door was open to me. From his own experience joining the Air Force as a young man, Mike had a clue to the riddle. While the rigors of his induction weren't quite as harrowing as those of West Point, there were notable similarities. The most important were challenges that exceeded current skills. For the first time in their lives, Mike and the other recruits were being asked on an hourly basis to do things they couldn't yet do. Within 2 weeks, Mike recalls, I was tired, lonely, frustrated, and ready to quit, as were all of my classmates. Some did quit, but Mike did not. What struck Mike was that rising to the occasion had almost nothing to do with talent. Those who dropped out of training rarely did so from lack of ability. Rather, what mattered, Mike said, was a never give up attitude. Around that time, it wasn't just Mike Matthews who was talking to me about this kind of hang-in-there posture toward challenge. As a graduate student just beginning to probe the psychology of success, I was interviewing leaders in business, art, athletics, journalism, academia, medicine, and law. Who are the people at the very top of your field? What are they like? What do you think makes them special? Some of the characteristics that emerged in these interviews were very field-specific. For instance, more than one business person mentioned an appetite for taking financial risks. You've got to be able to make calculated decisions about millions of dollars and still go to sleep at night. But this seemed entirely beside the point for artists, who instead mentioned a drive to create. I like making stuff. I don't know why, but I do. In contrast, athletes mentioned a different kind of motivation, one driven by the thrill of victory. Winners love to go head-to-head with other people. Winners hate losing. In addition to these particulars, there emerged certain commonalities, and they were what interested me most. No matter the field, the most successful people were lucky and talented. I'd heard that before, and I didn't doubt it. But the story of success didn't end there. Many of the people I talked to could also recount tales of rising stars who, to everyone's surprise, dropped out or lost interest before they could realize their potential. Apparently, it was critically important and not at all easy to keep going after failure. Some people are great when things are going well, but they fall apart when things aren't. High achievers described in these interviews really stuck it out. This one guy, he wasn't actually the best writer at the beginning. I mean, we used to read his stories and have a laugh because the writing was so, clumsy and melodramatic, but he got better and better, and last year he won a Guggenheim, and they were constantly driven to improve. She's never satisfied. You'd think she would be by now, but she's her own harshest critic. The highly accomplished were paragons of perseverance. Why were the highly accomplished so dogged in their pursuits? For most, there was no realistic expectation of ever catching up to their ambitions. In their own eyes, they were never good enough. They were the opposite of complacent, and yet, in a very real sense, they were satisfied being unsatisfied. Each was chasing something of unparalleled interest and importance, and it was the chase, as much as the capture, that was gratifying. Even if some of the things they had to do were boring or frustrating or even painful, they wouldn't dream of giving up. Their passion was enduring. In sum, no matter the domain, the highly successful had a kind of ferocious determination that played out in 2 ways. First, these exemplars were unusually resilient and hard-working. Second, they knew in a very, very deep way what it was they wanted. They not only had determination, they had direction. It was this combination of passion and perseverance that made high achievers special. In a word, they had grit. For me, the question became, how do you measure something so intangible? Something that decades of military psychologists hadn't been able to quantify? Something those very successful people I'd interviewed said they could recognize on sight, but couldn't think of how to directly test for. I sat down and looked over my interview notes, and I started writing questions that captured, sometimes verbatim, descriptions of what it means to have grit. Half of the questions were about perseverance. They asked how much you agree with statements like, I have overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge, and I finish whatever I begin. The other half of the questions were about passion. They asked whether your interests change from year to year and the extent to which you have been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time, but later lost interest. What emerged was the grit scale, a test that, when taken honestly, measures the extent to which you approach life with grit. In July 2004, on the second day of Beast, 1,218 West Point cadets sat down to take the grit scale. The day before, cadets had said goodbye to their mums and dads, a farewell for which West Point allocates exactly 90 seconds, gotten their heads shaved, just the men, changed out of civilian clothing and into the famous grey and white West Point uniform, and received their footlockers, helmets, and other gear. Though they may have mistakenly thought they already knew how, they were instructed by a fourth-year cadet in the proper way to stand in line. Step up to my line, not on my line, not over my line, not behind my line. Step up to my line. Initially, I looked to see how grit scores lined up with aptitude. Guess what? Grit scores bore absolutely no relationship to the whole candidate scores that had been so painstakingly calculated during the admissions process. In other words, how talented a cadet was said nothing about their grit, and vice versa. The separation of grit from talent was consistent with Mike's observations of Air Force training, but when I first stumbled onto this finding, it came as a real surprise. After all, why shouldn't the talented endure? Logically, the talented should stick around and try hard, because when they do phenomenally well. At West Point, for example, among cadets who ultimately make it through Beast, the whole candidate score is a marvelous predictor of every metric West Point tracks. It not only predicts academic grades, but military and physical fitness marks as well. So it's surprising, really, that talent is no guarantee of grit. In this book, we'll explore the reasons why. By the last day of Beast, 71 cadets had dropped out. Grit turned out to be an astoundingly reliable predictor of who made it through and who did not. The next year, I returned to West Point to run the same study. This time, 62 cadets dropped out of Beast, and again, grit predicted who would stay. In contrast, stayers and leavers had indistinguishable whole candidate scores. I looked a little closer at the individual components that make up the score. Again, no differences. So, what matters for making it through Beast? Not your SAT scores, not your high school rank, not your leadership experience, not your athletic ability, not your whole candidate score. What matters is grit. Does grit matter beyond West Point? To find out, I looked for other situations so challenging that a lot of people drop out. I wanted to know whether it was just the rigors of Beast that demanded grit, or whether in general, grit helped people stick to their commitments. The next arena where I tested grit's power was sales, a profession in which daily, if not hourly, rejection is par for the course. I asked hundreds of men and women employed at the same vacation timeshare company to answer a battery of personality questionnaires, including the grit scale. 6 months later, I revisited the company, by which time 55% of the salespeople were gone. Grit predicted who stayed and who left. Moreover, no other commonly measured personality trait, including extroversion, emotional stability, and conscientiousness, was as effective as grit in predicting job retention. Around the same time, I received a call from the Chicago Public Schools. Like the psychologists at West Point, researchers, they were eager to learn more about the students who would successfully earn their high school diplomas. That spring, thousands of high school juniors completed an abbreviated grit scale, along with a battery of other questionnaires. More than a year later, 12% of those students failed to graduate. Students who graduated on schedule were grittier, and grit was a more powerful predictor of graduation than how much students cared about school, how conscientious they were about their studies, and even how safe they felt at school. Likewise, in 2 large American samples, I found that grittier adults were more likely to get further in their formal schooling. Adults who'd earned an MBA, PhD, MD, JD, or another graduate degree were grittier than those who'd only graduated from 4-year colleges, who were in turn grittier than those who'd accumulated some college credits, but no degree. Interestingly, adults who'd successfully earned degrees from 2-year colleges scored slightly higher than graduates of 4-year colleges. This puzzled me at first, but I soon learned that the dropout rates at community colleges can be as high as 80%. Those who defy the odds are especially gritty. In parallel, I started a partnership with the Army Special Operations Forces, better known as the Green Berets. These are among the Army's best trained soldiers, assigned some of the toughest and most dangerous missions. Training for the Green Berets is a grueling, multi-stage affair. The stage I studied comes after 9 weeks of boot camp, 4 weeks of infantry training, 3 weeks of airborne school, and 4 weeks of a preparation course focused on land navigation. All these preliminary training experiences are very, very hard, and at every stage there are men who don't make it through. But the Special Forces selection course is even harder. In the words of its commanding general, James Parker, this is where we decide who will and who will not enter the final stages of Green Beret training. The selection course makes Beast Barracks look like summer vacation. Starting before dawn, trainees go full throttle until 9 in the evening. In addition to daytime and nighttime navigation exercises, there are 4 and 6 mile runs and marches, sometimes under a 65-pound load, and attempts at an obstacle course informally known as Nasty Nick, which includes crawling through water under barbed wire, walking on elevated logs, negotiating cargo nets, and swinging from horizontal ladders. Just getting to the selection course is an accomplishment, but even so, 42% of the candidates I studied voluntarily withdrew before it was over. So, what distinguished the men who made it through? Grit. What else, other than grit, predicts success in the military, education, and business? In sales, I found that prior experience helps. Novices are less likely to keep their jobs than those with experience. In the Chicago public school system, a supportive teacher made it more likely that students would graduate. And for aspiring Green Berets, baseline physical fitness at the start of training is essential. But in each of these domains, when you compare people matched on these characteristics, grit still predicts success. Regardless of specific attributes and advantages that help someone succeed in each of these diverse domains of challenge, grit matters in all of them. The year I started graduate school, the documentary Spellbound was released. The film follows 3 boys and 5 girls as they prepare for and compete in the finals of the Scripps National Spelling Bee. To get to the finals, an adrenaline-filled 3-day affair staged annually in Washington, D.C. and broadcast live on ESPN, which normally focuses its programming on high-stakes sports matchups. These kids must first outspell thousands of other students from hundreds of schools across the country. This means spelling increasingly obscure words without a single error in round after round, first besting all the other students in the contestants' classroom, then in their grade, school, district, and region. Spellbound got me wondering, to what extent is flawlessly spelling words like schottischer and cymotrichus a matter of precocious verbal talent, and to what extent is grit at play? I called the Bee's executive director, a dynamic woman and former champion speller herself, named Paige Kimball. Kimball was as curious as I was to learn more about the psychological makeup of winners. She agreed to send out questionnaires to all 273 spellers just as soon as they qualified for the finals, which would take place several months later. In return for the princely reward of a $25 gift card, about 2/3 of the spellers returned the questionnaires to my lab. The oldest respondent was 15 years old, the absolute age limit according to competition rules, and the youngest was just 7. In addition to completing the grit scale, spellers reported how much time they devoted to spelling practice. On average, they practiced more than an hour a day on weekdays and more than 2 hours a day on weekends. But there was a lot of variation around these averages. Some spellers were hardly studying at all, and some were studying as much as 9 hours on a given Saturday. Separately, I contacted a subsample of spellers and administered a verbal intelligence test. As a group, the spellers demonstrated unusual verbal ability, but there was a fairly wide range of scores, with some kids scoring at the verbal prodigy level and others average for their age. When ESPN aired the final rounds of the competition, I watched all the way through to the concluding suspenseful moments when, at last, 13-year-old Anurag Kashyap correctly spelled APPOGGIATURA, a musical term for a kind of grace note, to win the championship. Then, with the final rankings in hand, I analyzed my data. Here's what I found. Measurements of grit taken months before the final competition predicted how well spellers would eventually perform. Put simply, grittier kids went further in competition. How did they do it? By studying many more hours, and also by competing in more spelling bees. What about talent? Verbal intelligence also predicted getting further in competition, but there was no relationship at all between verbal IQ and grit. What's more, verbally talented spellers did not study any more than less able spellers, nor did they have a longer track record of competition. The separation of grit and talent emerged again in a separate study I ran on Ivy League undergraduates. There, SAT scores and grit were in fact inversely correlated. Students in that select sample who had higher SAT scores were, on average, just slightly less gritty than their peers. Putting together this finding with the other data I'd collected, I came to a fundamental insight that would guide my future work. Our potential is one thing. What we do with it is quite another. Chapter 2. Before I became a psychologist, I was a teacher. It was there, in the classroom, years before I had even heard the term grit, that I first began to realize that talent is not the only thing that matters. I was 27 when I made the jump. A month earlier, I had resigned from my position at McKinsey, the global management consulting firm. My colleagues were baffled. Why would anyone leave a company that was universally regarded as a gathering place for the world's best and brightest? To them, I was trading a prestigious career and a generous salary for a job that was notoriously difficult and underpaid, but I felt a pull toward education that the corporate world couldn't satisfy. My first assignment was teaching 7th grade math in the Lower East Side of New York City. My students were 12 and 13 years old, living in rough neighborhoods. From the very first week, I noticed something that contradicted everything I had assumed about learning. There were students who picked up mathematical concepts with effortless grace. I would explain a problem once, and they would see the underlying pattern immediately. They were the gifted ones. And yet, when the first marking period ended, I was stunned to find that many of these talented students were earning mediocre grades. Conversely, there were students who initially struggled. They didn't get it the first time, or even the second, but they were the ones who stayed after class. They asked questions, they took detailed notes, they tried, failed, and tried again. And consistently, these strivers ended up outperforming their more talented peers. I had always assumed that math was a subject where aptitude was destiny. I thought the gap between the naturals and the rest would widen over time. I was wrong. I was distracted by talent. Later, I moved to San Francisco and taught at Lowell High School, a public school that admits students based on academic merit. It was a pressure cooker of high achievement. There, I met a student named David. David was in my regular algebra class, not the accelerated track. He was quiet, sitting in the back, never raising his hand. But I soon noticed that every assignment he turned in was perfect. He was hungry for more. Realizing he was misplaced, I had him transferred to the accelerated track. Years later, David told me about that transition. He had struggled initially. He went from getting easy A's to getting a D on his first test in the advanced class. Most students would have crumbled or concluded they weren't math people. David didn't. He went to the teacher, figured out what he did wrong, and simply worked harder. By his senior year, he scored a perfect 5 on the AP Calculus exam. He went on to Swarthmore and then earned a PhD in mechanical engineering from UCLA. The boy who was once deemed not ready for the fast track is now a rocket scientist. Stories like David's made me question the cultural obsession with talent. This obsession isn't new. In 1869, Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, published a study on high achievers, concluding that ability was the primary driver of success. Darwin, however, disagreed. In a letter to Galton, he wrote that he had always maintained that, except for fools, men did not differ much in intellect, only in zeal and hard work. Darwin himself is a fascinating case study. He was not considered a genius in his youth. He didn't have the lightning-fast cognition we associate with brilliance. By his own admission, he was a plodder. He couldn't follow long, abstract trains of thought. His memory was poor. Yet he possessed a fanatical power of observation and a relentless drive to understand the laws of nature. He kept questions alive in the back of his mind for decades, long after others would have moved on. William James, the father of American psychology, echoed this sentiment in his essay, The Energies of Men. He argued that most human beings live far within their limits. We possess powers of various sorts that we habitually fail to use. The issue isn't our capacity, but our lethargy. If effort is so critical, why do we remain so fixated on talent? Research by Chia-Jung Tsai sheds light on this. She surveyed professional musicians who claimed that they valued hard work and training above all else. But when she played them recordings of two pianists, one described as a natural and the other as a striver, they consistently judged the natural as superior and more hireable. even though they were actually listening to the same player. She found the same bias in entrepreneurship. We say we value the hustle, but deep down, we are seduced by the myth of the natural. This naturalness bias has real-world consequences. During my time at McKinsey, the firm was obsessed with finding talent. They recruited from elite universities and used brain teasers to identify smart people. This philosophy, popularized as the war for talent, suggests that the key to business success is hiring the smartest people and letting them shine. But consider Enron. Enron was the ultimate example of this mindset. They hired the smartest guys in the room and created a culture where looking smart was more important than learning or integrity. They graded employees constantly, firing the bottom 15% every year. This didn't create excellence. It created a narcissistic culture of arrogance and deception. The obsession with talent blinded them to the importance of character and grit. The focus on talent can also be destructive to individuals. My colleague Scott Barry Kaufman was labeled a slow learner as a child due to auditory processing issues. He was placed in special education and told he had a low IQ. He believed it. It wasn't until a teacher took an interest in him that he began to challenge that label. He discovered the cello and practiced with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, 8 or 9 hours a day. He became a skilled musician, then an opera singer, and eventually a cognitive psychologist. He had plenty of talent, but it was his grit that allowed him to escape the box the educational system had put him in. Why do we cling to the idea of talent? Why do we prefer to believe that Mark Spitz was born a fish rather than acknowledging the thousands of hours he spent swimming laps? Nietzsche offered the best explanation. He argued that we mythologize genius because it lets us off the hook. If we believe that great things are accomplished by magic or divine gift, we don't have to compare ourselves to them. We can say, he's a genius. And in doing so, we imply, there is no need for me to compete. To see the act of becoming, the messy, exhausting, mundane reality of practice and failure, is to ruin the magic. We prefer the illusion of effortless perfection. But by focusing on the finished product, we obscure the process that created it. We are distracted by talent, and in doing so, we ignore the power of effort. And as I would come to learn, effort counts not just once, but twice. Source. Book 1. Before I became a psychologist, I was a teacher. It was there, in the classroom, years before I'd even heard the term grit, that I first began to realize that talent is not the only thing that matters. I was 27 when I made the jump. A month earlier, I had resigned from my position at McKinsey, the global management consulting firm. My colleagues were baffled. Why would anyone leave a company that was universally regarded as a gathering place for the world's best and brightest? To them, I was trading a prestigious career and a generous salary for a job that was notoriously difficult and underpaid. But I felt a pull toward education that the corporate world couldn't satisfy. My first assignment was teaching 7th grade math in the Lower East Side of New York City. My students were 12 and 13 years old, living in rough neighborhoods. From the very first week, I noticed something that contradicted everything I had assumed about learning. There were students who picked up mathematical concepts with effortless grace. I would explain a problem once, and they would see the underlying pattern immediately. They were the gifted ones. And yet, when the first marking period ended, I was stunned to find that many of these talented students were earning mediocre grades. Conversely, there were students who initially struggled. They didn't get it the first time, or even the second, but they were the ones who stayed after class. They asked questions. They took detailed notes. They tried, failed, and tried again. And consistently, these strivers ended up outperforming their more talented peers. I had always assumed that math was a subject where aptitude was destiny. I thought the gap between the naturals and the rest would widen over time. I was wrong. I was distracted by talent. Later, I moved to San Francisco and taught at Lowell High School, a public school that admits students based on academic merit. It was a pressure cooker of high achievement. There, I met a student named David. David was in my regular algebra class, not the accelerated track. He was quiet, sitting in the back, never raising his hand, but I soon noticed that every assignment he turned in was perfect. He was hungry for more. Realizing he was misplaced, I had him transferred to the accelerated track. Years later, David told me about that transition. He had struggled initially. He went from getting easy A's to getting a D on his first test in the advanced class. Most students would have crumbled or concluded they weren't math people. David didn't. He went to the teacher, figured out what he did wrong, and simply worked harder. By his senior year, he scored a perfect 5 on the AP Calculus exam. He went on to Swarthmore and then earned a PhD in mechanical engineering from UCLA. The boy who was once deemed not ready for the fast track is now a rocket scientist. Stories like David's made me question the cultural obsession with talent. This obsession isn't new. In 1869, Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, published a study on high achievers, concluding that ability was the primary driver of success. Darwin, however, disagreed. In a letter to Galton, he wrote that he had always maintained that, except for fools, men did not differ much in intellect, only in zeal and hard work. Darwin himself is a fascinating case study. He was not considered a genius in his youth. He didn't have the lightning-fast cognition we associate with brilliance. By his own admission, he was a plodder. He couldn't follow long, abstract trains of thought. His memory was poor, yet he possessed a fanatical power of observation and a relentless drive to understand the laws of nature. He kept questions alive in the back of his mind for decades, long after others would have moved on. William James, the father of American psychology, echoed this sentiment in his essay, The Energies of Men. He argued that most human beings live far within their limits. We possess powers of various sorts that we habitually fail to use. The issue isn't our capacity, but our lethargy. If effort is so critical, why do we remain so fixated on talent? Research by Chia-Jung Tsai sheds light on this. She surveyed professional musicians who claimed that they valued hard work and training above all else. But when she played them recordings of two pianists, one described as a natural and the other as a striver, they consistently judged the natural as superior and more hireable, even though they were actually listening to the same player. She found the same bias in entrepreneurship. We say we value the hustle, but deep down we are seduced by the myth of the natural. This naturalness bias has real-world consequences. During my time at McKinsey, the firm was obsessed with finding talent. They recruited from elite universities and used brain teasers to identify smart people. This philosophy, popularized as the war for talent, suggests that the key to business success is hiring the smartest people and letting them shine. But consider Enron. Enron was the ultimate example of this mindset. They hired the smartest guys in the room and created a culture where looking smart was more important than learning or integrity. They graded employees constantly, firing the bottom 15% every year. This didn't create excellence. It created a narcissistic culture of arrogance and deception. The obsession with talent blinded them to the importance of character and grit. The focus on talent can also be destructive to individuals. My colleague Scott Barry Kaufman was labeled a slow learner as a child due to auditory processing issues. He was placed in special education and told he had a low IQ. He believed it. It wasn't until a teacher took an interest in him that he began to challenge that label. He discovered the cello and practiced with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, 8 or 9 hours a day. He became a skilled musician, then an opera singer, and eventually a cognitive psychologist. He had plenty of talent, but it was his grit that allowed him to escape the box the educational system had put him in. Why do we cling to the idea of talent? Why do we prefer to believe that Mark Spitz was born a fish rather than acknowledging the thousands of hours he spent swimming laps? Nietzsche offered the best explanation. He argued that we mythologize genius because it lets us off the hook. If we believe that great things are accomplished by magic or divine gift, we don't have to compare ourselves to them. We can say, he is a genius, and in doing so, we imply, there is no need for me to compete. To see the act of becoming, the messy, exhausting, mundane reality of practice and failure, is to ruin the magic. We prefer the illusion of effortless perfection. But by focusing on the finished product, we obscure the process that created it. We are distracted by talent, and in doing so, we ignore the power of effort. And as I would come to learn, effort counts not just once, but twice. Chapter 3. I hear the word talent constantly. Open any newspaper, scroll through any social media feed, or listen to any casual conversation about success, and you will find it. Whether it's a glowing profile of a musician, a breakdown of a star athlete's performance, or a story about a rising political figure, the narrative is almost always the same. They are gifted. They possess something innate, something magical that the rest of us simply do not have. If we focus too much on talent, we inevitably minimize everything else. In the extreme, we seem to believe that talent is a fixed asset and that effort is merely a variable we adjust to display that asset. We look at Bill Clinton and say he is a natural politician, while Hillary Clinton is merely a striver. The implication is brutal and clear. The striver, no matter how hard they work, will never quite possess the grace of the natural. Even I am guilty of this. When I see someone perform a feat of intellect or skill that dazzles me, my reflex is to think, what a genius. But I know better. I know that this reflex is a shortcut that obscures the truth. Years ago, the sociologist Dan Chambliss conducted a study of competitive swimmers titled The Mundanity of Excellence. His conclusion was as profound as it was unsexy. Superlative performance is really just a confluence of dozens of small skills or activities, each one learned or stumbled upon, which have been carefully drilled into habit and then fitted together into a synthesized whole. There is nothing extraordinary or superhuman in any one of those actions. Only the fact that they are done consistently and correctly and all together produce excellence. When Dan tried to share these findings, a colleague told him, "You need to jazz it up. You need to make these people more interesting." But Dan refused to manufacture mystery where there was none. He knew that the secret to excellence was not a gene or a mystical gift, but the accumulation of mundane acts. He told me about the time he watched Mark Spitz, the legendary swimmer who had won 7 gold medals in 1972, return to the pool 12 years after his retirement. Spitz was in his mid-30s. He got into the water with Rowdy Gaines, the current world record holder. They raced sprint laps. Gaines won most of them. But by the halfway point, the entire team had stopped training to stand at the edge of the pool and watch Spitz. One swimmer turned to Dan and whispered, "My God, he's a fish." Even to elite athletes, superior performance feels like magic. We want to believe it is magic. Nietzsche, the philosopher, understood this human tendency perfectly. He wrote, "With everything perfect, we do not ask how it came to be. Instead, we rejoice in the present fact as though it came out of the ground by magic." Why? Because if we see the act of becoming, the years of struggle, the failures, the endless repetition, we grow cool. The magic fades, but more importantly, as Nietzsche observed, our vanity, our self-love, promotes the cult of the genius. If we think of genius as something magical, we are not obliged to compare ourselves and find ourselves lacking. To call someone divine means, here, there's no need to compete. Mythologizing talent lets us off the hook. It allows us to relax into the status quo. It removes the burden of effort. During my second year of graduate school, I had a meeting with my advisor, Marty Seligman. Marty is a giant in the field of psychology, a man who does not suffer fools gladly. In the middle of my report on my research, he interrupted me. "You haven't had a good idea in 2 years, he said. I was stunned. I had only been in graduate school for 2 years, he continued. You can do all kinds of fancy statistics. You've made a few insightful observations. But you don't have a theory. You don't have a theory for the psychology of achievement." I left his office and cried. I went home and cried some more. But his words, "You don't have a theory," rattled around in my brain. I realized he was right. I had observed that talent wasn't enough, but I hadn't explained how talent and effort fit together. I spent the next decade working on that theory. I filled dozens of lab notebooks with diagrams and equations. Finally, I arrived at 2 simple equations that explain the mechanics of achievement: talent, x effort; skill, x effort. Achievement, talent, is how quickly your skills improve when you invest effort. Achievement is what happens when you take your acquired skills and use them. Notice that effort appears in both equations. Effort counts twice. First, effort builds skill. Without effort, your talent is nothing more than unmet potential. It is only with effort that talent becomes a skill. Second, effort makes skill productive. Having a skill is not the same as using it. You can be the world's greatest writer, but if you don't write the book, you have achieved nothing. Consider the potter Warren Mackenzie. He has spent his entire adult life making pots. He told me that the first 10,000 pots are difficult, and then it gets a little easier. As he improved, he produced more good pots a day. Talent x effort, skill. But he didn't stop there. He continued to work every day, producing a lifetime of work that has touched thousands of people. Skill x effort, achievement. Or consider the writer John Irving. Irving was not a natural. He was severely dyslexic and struggled in school. He earned a C in English and had to stay in high school an extra year to graduate, but he learned that to do anything well, he had to overextend himself. He had to pay twice as much attention. He rewrote his novels again and again. Rewriting is what I do best as a writer, he told me. Through relentless effort, he turned his lack of natural talent into a skill, and then use that skill to produce a body of work that includes the world, according to Garp and the Cider House rules. Will Smith, the actor and musician, puts it even more bluntly. I've never really viewed myself as particularly talented, he said. Where I excel is ridiculous, sickening work ethic. He explained that if he and another person get on a treadmill, there are only two outcomes. The other person gets off first, or Will Smith dies on the treadmill. Decades ago, Harvard researchers actually tested this idea with a treadmill test. They asked young men to run on a treadmill at a steep angle and fast speed until they were exhausted. The test was designed to measure stamina and strength of will. Years later, a psychiatrist named George Vaillant followed up on these men. He found that their time on the treadmill at age 20 was a surprisingly reliable predictor of their psychological adjustment in adulthood. It wasn't just physical fitness, it was grit. The lesson is clear. Talent matters, but effort counts twice. It is the engine that turns talent into skill and skill into achievement. Without it, you may have potential, but you will never have impact. Chapter 4. I recently gave a lecture on grit to undergraduates at the Wharton School of Business. As I was gathering my notes, an aspiring entrepreneur rushed the stage. He was breathless with energy, eager to tell me a story that he believed illustrated his prodigious grit. Earlier that year, he had raised thousands of dollars for his startup. He described the heroic lengths he had gone to, the all-nighters he had pulled, the sheer intensity of his effort. I was impressed, and I told him so, but I also offered a caveat. Grit is more about stamina than intensity, I said. So if you're working on that project with the same energy in a year or two, email me. I can say more about your grit then. He looked puzzled. Well, I might not be working on the same thing in a few years. Okay, I said. But skipping around from one kind of pursuit to another, from one skill set to an entirely different one, that's not what gritty people do. But what if I move around a lot? And while I'm doing that, I'm working incredibly hard. Grit isn't just working incredibly hard, I replied. That's only part of it. He paused. Why? Well, for one thing, there are no shortcuts to excellence. Developing real expertise takes time, and then you've got to apply those skills to produce something valuable. Rome wasn't built in a day, I continued, and here's the really important thing. Grit is about working on something you care about so much that you're willing to stay loyal to it. It's doing what you love, he said. I get that. Right, I said. It's doing what you love, but not just falling in love, staying in love. How gritty are you? Below is a version of the grit scale I developed for my study at West Point and use in my research. Read each sentence and ask yourself how you compare to most people. New ideas and projects sometimes distract me from previous ones. 5 or not at all like me. 1, sir, very much like me. Setbacks don't discourage me. I don't give up easily. 1, sir, not at all like me. 5, sir, very much like me. I often set a goal, but later choose to pursue a different one. 5. Not at all like me. 1. Very much like me. I am a hard worker. 1. Not at all like me. 5. Very much like me. I have difficulty maintaining my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete. 5. Oh, not at all like me. 1. Whoa, very much like me. I finish whatever I begin. 1 more, not at all like me. 5 more, very much like me. My interests change from year to year. 5 were not at all like me. 1 very much like me. I am diligent. I never give up. not at all like me. 5. Very much like me. I have been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time, but later lost interest. 5. Not at all like me. 1. Very much like me. I have overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge. 1. Not at all like me. 5. Very much like me. To calculate your total grit score, add up all the points and divide by 10. The maximum score is 5, extremely gritty, and the lowest is 1, not at all gritty. Grit has 2 components, passion and perseverance. If you want to dig deeper, calculate separate scores. For your passion score, average your points for the odd-numbered items. For perseverance, average the even-numbered items. If you are like most people I study, your perseverance score is likely a bit higher than your passion score. I scored 4.6 overall, 5.0 on perseverance, but only 4.2 on passion. Staying focused on consistent goals over time is often harder than working hard. You might notice that the passion questions don't ask how intensely you are committed, but rather how consistently. Enthusiasm is common. Endurance is rare. Consider Jeffrey Gettleman. He is the East Africa bureau chief for the New York Times and a Pulitzer Prize winner. I met Jeff when we were both in our early 20s at Oxford. Back then, neither of us knew what we wanted to be. Recently, I asked him about his passion. He didn't say journalism. He said, "My passion is to live and work in East Africa." Journalism was merely the means to that end. Jeff's path was winding. He started as a photographer for a student paper, interned at a small paper in Wisconsin, moved to Florida, then to Atlanta, then overseas to cover wars, and finally, more than a decade later, he landed his dream job in Nairobi. His passion wasn't a firework that exploded and faded, it was a compass. It guided him through years of difficulty and boring steps to get where he wanted to be. Pete Carroll, the coach of the Seattle Seahawks, puts it this way: "Do you have a life philosophy?" For Pete, a clear philosophy organizes everything. It helps you prioritize. You can visualize goals in a hierarchy. At the bottom are concrete, short-term tasks. Write email, go to meeting. These are means to an end. Above them are mid-level goals. Be punctual, finish project. At the very top is your ultimate concern. This is an end in itself. For Tom Seaver, the Hall of Fame pitcher, it was pitching the best I possibly can day after day. This top-level goal dictated everything. What he ate, when he slept, even that he shouldn't get a sunburn because it might hinder his throwing. Grit is about holding the same top-level goal for a very long time. It organizes your life. Many people lack grit, not because they are lazy, but because their goal structure is incoherent. They might have positive fantasies, dreaming of being a doctor without the mid-level goals to get there. Or they have a bunch of mid-level goals that don't connect to a unified purpose. Or they have competing goal hierarchies that pull them in different directions. Warren Buffett reportedly gave his pilot a simple exercise for prioritizing. He told him to write down 25 career goals, then circle the top 5. The remaining 20? Avoid them at all costs. They are the distractions that eat away your time and energy. When I tried this, I found it difficult, but eventually I realized that most of my goals were related to one ultimate concern: helping kids thrive. The few that weren't, I had to let them go. Giving up on lower-level goals is sometimes necessary. If a strategy isn't working, swap it out. Be flexible with the means, but stubborn with the end. In 1926, psychologist Catherine Cox studied 301 historical geniuses from Newton to Napoleon. She wanted to know what separated the most eminent from the rest. It wasn't IQ. The difference in intelligence between the top 10 and the bottom 10 was negligible. What distinguished the titans of history was persistence of motive. They worked with distant objects in view. They did not abandon tasks from mere changeability. They possessed a quiet determination to stick to a course once decided upon. High, but not the highest intelligence, combined with the greatest degree of persistence, will achieve greater eminence than the highest degree of intelligence with somewhat less persistence. However you scored on the grit scale, remember, it's a reflection of where you are now, not where you must stay. Grit can grow. Chapter 5. How much of our grit is in our genes? I'm asked this question nearly every time I give a talk. The nature versus nurture debate is fundamental to how we see ourselves. We intuitively understand that some traits, like height, are largely determined by the genetic lottery, while others, like speaking French or playing the piano, are the result of upbringing and practice. "You can't teach height" is a common refrain in basketball, and people want to know if grit is more like height or more like a jump shot. To the question of whether we inherit grit from our DNA, there is a short answer and a long one. The short answer is, in part. The long answer is more complicated, but far more important. First, let me state with absolute conviction, every human trait is influenced by both genes and experience. Take height. It is undeniably heritable. Genetic differences explain why some people are tall and others are short. But it is also true that the average height of men and women has increased dramatically over the last few centuries. Military records show that the average British man was 5 feet 5 inches tall 150 years ago. Today, he's 5 feet 10. In the Netherlands, the average man is now over 6 feet tall, a gain of more than 6 inches. These massive shifts didn't happen because our gene pool suddenly mutated. They happened because of better nutrition, cleaner water, and modern medicine. Environment matters. If you feed a child well, they will grow taller. If they are malnourished, their growth will be stunted. The same is true for psychological traits: honesty, generosity, IQ, extroversion, and yes, grit. All of these are influenced by our genes and by our experience. Nature matters, and so does nurture. Even talent is not entirely genetic. We might be born with a predisposition for music or math, but the rate at which we develop that skill is heavily influenced by our environment. Consider Dan Chambliss, the sociologist who studied swimmers. He swam competitively in high school, but quit because he believed he wasn't built for it. "I can't point my toes," he told me. "My ankles won't plantar flex. I have an anatomical limitation." But years later, he realized that his biggest impediment wasn't his ankles, it was his coaching. "I had horrible coaches," he said. "One of them taught me literally nothing. He taught me the breaststroke turn incorrectly." When Dan finally got good coaching later in life, he got back in the pool and swam times that matched his high school bests. So, how do we know for sure that grit is heritable? Researchers study twins. By comparing identical twins, who share 100% of their DNA, with fraternal twins, who share about 50%, scientists can estimate how much of a trait is genetic. A recent study of over 2,000 pairs of twins in the UK found that the heritability of perseverance is about 37% and passion is about 20%. This means that some of the variation in grit is genetic, but a huge portion is not. And importantly, there is no single grit gene. Like height or intelligence, grit is polygenic, influenced by thousands of different genes all interacting with each other. But here is the critical point. Just because something is genetic doesn't mean it can't change. We often assume that if a trait is genetic, it is fixed. We think, I have the genes for blue eyes, so my eyes will always be blue. But psychological traits are not like eye color. They are plastic. They change over time. Consider the Flynn effect. IQ scores have been rising steadily around the world for decades. The average person today scores significantly higher on an IQ test than a person from 1900 would have. Did we get smarter genes? No. We got better at abstract thinking because our environment demands it. We live in a world of hypothetical reasoning and complex symbols, and our brains have adapted. Grit can change too. I have found that grit tends to increase with age. Adults in their 60s are significantly grittier than adults in their 30s. This could be because the greatest generation was simply raised to be tougher, but it is also likely that we learn to be gritty as we mature. We face setbacks. We learn that failure isn't fatal, and we develop the capacity to stick with things. We call this the maturity principle. As we grow up, we become more conscientious, more confident, and more stable. We får se stabbigt keywords. So if grit can grow, how does it happen? I believe there are two ways to grow grit. You can grow it from the inside out, by cultivating your own interests, habits, and sense of purpose. And you can grow it from the outside in, by surrounding yourself with parents, coaches, teachers, and a culture that demands and supports grit. Let's focus on the inside out first. Through my research, I have identified 4 psychological assets that gritty people possess. They develop them in a specific order: interest, Passion begins with enjoying what you do. You must be captivated by the endeavor. You must be like a child, full of curiosity and play. Practice. Once you are interested, you must devote yourself to the daily discipline of trying to get better. You must target your weaknesses and practice with focus. Whatever it takes, I want to improve, is the mantra. Purpose. Passion ripens into the conviction that your work matters. Interest without purpose is hard to sustain for a lifetime. You must feel that your work contributes to the well-being of others. Hope. This defines every stage. From the beginning to the end, you must have the resilience to keep going when things are difficult. If you get knocked down, you must believe you can get back up. You don't need to be born with these assets. You can learn them. You can discover your interests. You can learn to practice. You can cultivate purpose. You can teach yourself hope. You can grow your grit. Chapter 6. Follow your passion. I have heard this phrase in countless commencement speeches. I have heard it from Will Shortz, the editor of the New York Times crossword puzzle. I have heard it from Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. I have heard it from nearly every paragon of grit I have interviewed. But it was not the advice I heard growing up. My father told me that following your passion was a dangerous luxury. He warned me that idealistic dreams were a breadcrumb trail to poverty. He believed in practicality. He became a chemist not because he loved chemistry, his favorite subject was history, but because his father told him the family textile business needed a chemist. So, who is right, the commencement speakers or my dad? Research provides a definitive answer. People are enormously more satisfied with their jobs when they do something that fits their personal interests. They perform better, they are more helpful to co-workers. They stay in their jobs longer. Students whose interests align with their majors earn higher grades and are less likely to drop out. William James was right. The casting vote for success is desire and passion. However, there is a problem with the advice to follow your passion. It implies that passion is something fully formed that you simply find, like a lost set of keys. It suggests that one day you will have a cinematic epiphany, a moment where the clouds part and your destiny is revealed. I used to believe this too. I imagined that my grit paragons all had these moments. I pictured a young Julia Child taking one bite of sole meunière and instantly knowing she would become a master chef. But when I interviewed them, I heard a different story. Olympic swimmer Rowdy Gaines didn't fall in love with swimming instantly. He tried football, baseball, basketball, golf, and tennis first. He only stuck with swimming because he kept getting cut from other sports. Chef Mark Vetri was just as interested in music as he was in cooking. He spent years washing dishes and playing in bands before he committed to the kitchen. Even Julia Child's famous meal was just the beginning. It wasn't a lightning bolt that revealed her career. It was the first kiss in a long romance. It took her 40 years to find her true passion. Most of us, including the fleeting interest generation on Reddit, misunderstand how passion works. We think it is a discovery. In reality, it is a process of discovery, followed by development and then a lifetime of deepening. First, passion is not discovered through introspection. You cannot think your way into a passion. You have to interact with the world. You have to try things. You have to experiment. And often, the initial discovery goes unnoticed. You might not realize you are interested in something until you look back and see how much time you've spent on it. Second, interest must be triggered and re-triggered. It is not enough to see one space shuttle launch. You have to see several. You have to dig for information. You need a crew of supporters, parents, teachers, coaches, who provide positive feedback and encouragement. Third, and perhaps most importantly, before hard work comes play. Many parents I talk to want their children to have grit now. They want them to practice the violin for hours with disciplined focus. But they forget that even the most accomplished experts started as unserious beginners. Benjamin Bloom, who studied 120 world-class achievers, found that talent development progresses through 3 stages. The first stage, the early years, is defined by play and exploration. The best mentors at this stage are not drill sergeants. They are warm and supportive. They make learning fun. If you force a child to practice before they have developed a genuine interest, you risk extinguishing the spark before it can become a flame. You cannot skip the romance phase and go straight to the discipline phase. So, if you are lost, if you feel like you have no direction, stop looking for a lightning bolt. Stop waiting for perfection. Go out and try things. Be messy. Be inefficient. Let yourself be a beginner. Passion is not something you follow. It is something you build. Chapter 7. In my earliest research, I found that gritty kids at the National Spelling Bee practiced more than their less gritty competitors. This extra practice explained their superior performance. At the time, this made perfect sense. As a math teacher, I had seen that students who put in more time generally did better. It seemed like the major advantage of grit was simply more time on task. But then I started thinking about all the people I knew who had been doing their jobs for 20 years, but were still just okay. We all know people like this. They have decades of experience, but they seem to have stagnated. As a colleague of mine likes to joke, some people get 20 years of experience, while others get 1 year of experience. 20 times in a row. Clearly, time alone isn't enough. I turned to the work of cognitive psychologist Anders Ericsson. Ericsson has spent his career studying how experts acquire world-class skills. He has studied chess grandmasters, Olympic athletes, concert pianists, and more. His research reveals that experts don't just practice more, they practice differently. He calls it deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is not the same as flow. Flow is that magical state where you are so absorbed in an activity that time seems to vanish. It is effortless and enjoyable. Deliberate practice is the opposite. It is effortful, draining, and often not very fun. Here is the anatomy of deliberate practice. A clearly defined stretch goal. Experts don't just practice the piano, they isolate a specific tiny weakness, a single measure, a specific fingering, and they target it. They intentionally stretch themselves slightly beyond their current abilities. They operate in the zone of challenge exceeding skill. Full concentration and effort. You cannot do deliberate practice while watching TV or daydreaming. It requires 100% of your attention. Immediate and informative feedback. You need to know right away if you got it right or wrong, and you need to know how to fix it. Repetition with reflection and refinement. You don't just do it once, you do it over and over and over, making tiny adjustments each time until you have mastered it. Then you set a new stretch goal and start the process again. This is why deliberate practice is so hard. It is a constant confrontation with your own inadequacy. It is the daily discipline of failing, fixing, and failing again. I interviewed the legendary swimming coach Rowdy Gaines about this. He told me, "It's not fun, it's really not fun. You're in pain, you're tired, but you do it because you want the result." So, is grit just about suffering? Not exactly. While the act of deliberate practice is often grueling, gritty people seem to experience it differently. They don't necessarily enjoy the pain, but they find a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction in the improvement it brings. They are addicted to the feeling of getting better. The Japanese have a word for this, kaizen. It means continuous improvement. It is the refusal to accept a plateau. Gritty people are also more likely to experience flow, but usually not during deliberate practice. Flow happens when you are performing, when you are using the skills you have already mastered. Deliberate practice is for building skill. Flow is for using it. The good news is that you can learn to practice like an expert. You can apply the principles of deliberate practice to almost anything. Writing, coding, sales, even parenting. Identify a specific weakness. Don't just work. Work on something you are bad at. Focus. Turn off your phone. Close your email. Give it your full attention. Get feedback. Ask a boss, a mentor, or a peer to critique your work. Don't ask for praise. Ask for what you did wrong. Repeat. Do it again and again and again. I also wonder about our attitude toward failure. Babies are natural learners. Watch a baby try to walk. They fall, get up, fall, get up. They don't feel shame, they don't feel embarrassed, they just try again. But somewhere along the way, we learn to fear mistakes. We learn that failure is bad. We see adults frown when we mess up. We learn to protect our egos by not trying too hard. To grow grit, we need to unlearn this fear. We need to recover the toddler's fearless approach to learning. We need to embrace the struggle. When you are practicing, and it feels hard, and you are making mistakes, don't say, "I'm not good at this." Say, "This is hard, it's great," because that struggle is the sound of you getting better. Chapter 8. Interest is one source of passion. Purpose, the intention to contribute to the well-being of others, is another. The mature passions of gritty people depend on both. For some, purpose comes first. I think of Alex Scott, the little girl who diagnosed with neuroblastoma at age 1. Told her mother at age 4, "When I get out of the hospital, I want to have a lemonade stand." She wanted to raise money for her doctors to help other kids like they helped me. By the time she passed away 4 years later, she had inspired a movement that raised over $1 million. Today, Alex's Lemonade Stand Foundation has raised more than 100 million. Alex was extraordinary, but for most of us, the sequence is different. We usually start with a relatively self-oriented interest. We enjoy something. We get good at it through disciplined practice. And only later, often much later, do we appreciate how that personal interest might also benefit others. Benjamin Bloom, the psychologist who studied world-class achievers, noticed this pattern. He called it the later years, the final phase of learning when the larger purpose and meaning of one's work becomes apparent. When I talk to paragons of grit, they don't just tell me they have a goal. They tell me their goal matters. They don't just say, I want to be the best. They say, I want to help my children, or I want to save my sport, or I want to advance science. Aristotle distinguished between two kinds of happiness, hedonic and eudaimonic. Hedonic happiness is the pursuit of pleasure and self-gratification. Eudaimonic happiness is the pursuit of meaning and virtue, the good life. Gritty people aren't monks. They enjoy the hedonic pleasures of their work. They love the flow, the thrill of the win, the satisfaction of a job well done. But they are also driven by a eudaimonic desire to contribute. They have integrated their personal interests with a purpose that is bigger than themselves. This integration is powerful. Research shows that people who view their work as a calling, rather than just a job, necessity, or a career, stepping stone, are more satisfied and perform better. And this isn't limited to prestigious professions. You can find janitors who see their work as a calling, I make the school a safe place for children to learn, and executives who see their work as a grind. So how do you cultivate purpose if you don't feel it yet? First, remember that purpose is something you build, not something you find. It is a process of job crafting. You can maneuver within your current job to make it more meaningful. Amy Rozesniewski and her colleagues found that even in corporate settings, employees who tweaked their daily routines to connect with their core values became significantly happier and more effective. Second, reflect on how the work you're already doing can make a positive contribution to society. Ask yourself, how does what I do help other people? Third, find a role model. Bill Damon, a Stanford psychologist, suggests asking, can you think of someone whose life inspires you to be a better person? For me, that person is my mother. She is the kindest person I have ever met. Growing up, I didn't always appreciate her generosity. She would invite strangers to our Thanksgiving table, distant relatives, their roommates' friends. Anyone who had nowhere else to go was welcomed. One year, she gave away my birthday presents a month after I received them. Another time, she gave away my sister's entire stuffed animal collection. We cried and screamed, accusing her of not loving us. She was genuinely surprised. But there are children who need them more, she said. You have so much. They have so little. When I told my father I was quitting my path to medical school to start a non-profit for low-income children, he was furious. Why do you care about poor kids? He shouted. They're not family. You don't even know them. But I knew why. All my life, I had watched my mother. I had seen what one person could do to help many others. I had witnessed the power of purpose. Chapter 9. There is an old Japanese saying, fall 7, rise 8. If I were ever to get a tattoo, I'd get these 4 simple words indelibly inked. What is hope? We often think of hope as the expectation that tomorrow will be better than today. It's the feeling that the sun will come out, that the universe will smooth the path ahead. This is a passive hope. It comes without the burden of responsibility. Grit depends on a different kind of hope. It rests on the expectation that our own efforts can improve our future. It isn't, I have a feeling tomorrow will be better. It is, I resolve to make tomorrow better. During my freshman year of college, I enrolled in a neurobiology course. I sat in the front row, copied every equation, and did every reading. But when the first quiz came, I panicked. My mind was crowded with heart-palpitating thoughts. I'm not going to finish. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm going to fail. I got a miserable grade. My teaching assistant advised me to drop the course. You're just a freshman, he said. You can always take the class later. I refused. I studied madly for the midterm, and I failed again. This time, the teaching assistant was urgent. You do not want a failing grade on your transcript. It's not too late to withdraw. I thanked him and closed the door. In the hallway, I surprised myself by not crying. I reviewed the facts. I had failed twice. There was only one exam left, the final. I realized that my energetic studying wasn't working. I needed help. I went to the professor, I changed my study habits, I stopped panicking and started solving problems. I got an A on the final and an A in the class. This experience taught me a crucial lesson about hope. It's not about ignoring reality or pretending things are fine. It's about how we explain our failures to ourselves. Decades ago, psychological experiments on dogs revealed a phenomenon called learned helplessness. When dogs were subjected to painful shocks, they couldn't escape. They eventually stopped trying. Even when the cage door was later opened, they just lay there and whimpered. They had learned that their efforts didn't matter. Humans are the same. If we believe that our suffering is permanent and pervasive, we give up. But if we believe that our suffering is temporary and specific, and that we can do something about it, we persevere. This is learned optimism. I tested this with Teach for America teachers. I measured their optimistic explanatory style, how they explained bad events. Teachers who were optimists, who believed that setbacks were temporary and fixable, were grittier and more effective in the classroom. They didn't say, I'm a bad teacher, or these kids can't learn. They said, I need to try a different lesson plan, or this student is having a bad day. The same pattern appeared in a study of salespeople. Widely considered one of the most rejection-filled professions. Optimists outsold pessimists by 20 to 40%. So, how do you teach yourself hope? First, update your beliefs about intelligence and talent. If you believe that ability is fixed, that you are either smart or dumb, then failure is a verdict. It proves you lack the gift. But if you have a growth mindset, the belief that ability can be developed, then failure is just information. It tells you what you need to improve. Carol Dweck, a Stanford psychologist, has spent her career studying this. She found that students with a growth mindset are far more likely to persevere in the face of difficulty. They don't see struggle as a sign of weakness. They see it as the way you get stronger. Second, practice optimistic self-talk. We all have a constant monologue in our heads. When you fail, what does that voice say? Does it say, you're an idiot? Or does it say, that didn't work? Let's try something else. You can retrain this voice. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is essentially a formal way of doing this, challenging negative permanent explanations and replacing them with positive temporary ones. Finally, ask for a helping hand. Rhonda Hughes, a mathematician who overcame incredible odds to earn her PhD, told me that she almost never got back up all by herself. There was always someone who, in one way or another, told me to keep going. Hope is not something you have to generate entirely on your own. Sometimes you need to borrow it from a mentor, a teacher, or a friend. Grit grows from the inside out, through interest, practice, purpose, and hope. But it also grows from the outside in. We are not islands. We are deeply influenced by the people around us. In the next section, we will explore how parents, coaches, and culture can cultivate grit. Chapter 10. What can I do to encourage grit in the people I care for? I am asked this question constantly. Sometimes it's a parent, sometimes a CEO, sometimes a general. They all want to know the secret to raising gritty people. When I ask them for their own theories, I usually get two opposite answers. One camp believes that grit is forged in the crucible of adversity. They quote Nietzsche, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." They imagine that the way to build character is to be tough, to withhold praise, to push children to their limits. They echo the advice of John Watson, the 1928 parenting expert who warned against coddling and recommended never hugging or kissing your children. The other camp believes that grit blooms in a garden of unconditional love. They argue that children need support, warmth, and a safety net. They worry that pressure will crush a child's spirit. So who is right, the disciplinarians or the nurturers? The answer, it turns out, is both. Research on parenting styles has long identified four main categories based on two dimensions: support, warmth, and demandingness standards. Permissive parenting, high support, low demands. These parents are loving but have few rules. They are the cool parents. Authoritarian parenting, low support, high demands. These parents are strict and cold. Because I said so is their mantra. Neglectful parenting. Low support, low demands. These parents are absent or indifferent. Authoritative parenting, high support, high demands. These parents are affectionate and strict. They have high standards, but they provide the support children need to meet them. I prefer to call this fourth style wise parenting. Wise parents are demanding. They expect their children to do hard things, but they are also supportive. They respect their children's autonomy and provide emotional warmth. They don't just say, do this because I said so. They explain why. They listen. When I interviewed my grit paragons, I found a pattern. They didn't all have tiger mums, nor did they all have free-range parents, but almost all of them described a parent or a mentor who acted like a parent, who was both supportive and demanding. Steve Young, the Hall of Fame quarterback, told me about his father, Grit. Yeah, yes, his nickname was literally Grit. His dad was tough. He made Steve do hard physical labor, but he was also endlessly supportive. When Steve wanted to quit football in college because he was 8th on the depth chart, his dad didn't yell. He just said, "You can quit, but you can't come home because I'm not going to live with a quitter. You can stay there and not play, but you can't quit." It was a hard line, but it was delivered with love and the expectation that Steve was capable of more. Francesca Gino, a Harvard professor, told me about her parents. They were incredibly warm, but they also held her to high standards. When she came home with a 98 on a test, they would celebrate, but they would also ask, what happened to the other 2 points? Not in a way that made her feel inadequate, but in a way that showed they believed she could master the material completely. This wise parenting approach is not just for biological parents. It applies to coaches, teachers, and bosses. Consider Cody Coleman. Cody grew up in poverty. His father left before he was born. His mother was mentally ill and mostly absent. He was raised by his grandmother in a house without consistent electricity or food. He had every reason to be hopeless, but Cody had a wise parent in the form of his older brother. When Cody was struggling, his brother told him, "You have a choice. You can be a victim of your circumstances, or you can choose to be different." Later, a high school math teacher named Chantel noticed Cody's potential. She became his champion. She demanded that he apply to top colleges, even when he doubted himself. But she also drove him to school, bought him food, and welcomed him into her family for holidays. She was high support and high demand. Cody went to MIT. He graduated with a perfect GPA. He is now a PhD student at Stanford. When I asked Cody how he survived, he didn't talk about his own inner strength. He talked about the ecosystem of support he had. He talked about the people who expected him to be great and helped him get there. You don't need to be a biological parent to parent for grit. You just need to be wise. You need to be the person who says, "I have high expectations for you, and I know you can meet them." Chapter 11. I remember watching my 4-year-old daughter, Lucy, struggle to open a small box of raisins. She was hungry, and she wanted those raisins, but the cardboard flap refused to budge. After a minute of wrestling with it, she sighed, dropped the box on the kitchen table, and wandered off. I watched from the other room and nearly gasped. "Oh God," I thought, "my daughter has been defeated by a box of raisins. What are the odds she'll grow up to have any grit?" I rushed over and encouraged her to try again, doing my best to be both supportive and demanding. She refused. Not long after, I found a ballet studio around the corner and signed her up. Like many parents, I had a strong intuition that grit is cultivated in the playing fields. The ballet studio, the soccer pitch, the piano bench, the debate stage. These structured extracurricular activities possess 2 crucial features that are hard to replicate at home or in the classroom. First, there is an adult in charge who is not the parent, ideally a supportive and demanding mentor. Second, these pursuits are designed to cultivate interest, practice, purpose, and hope. But is this intuition backed by science? The evidence is incomplete because we can't randomly assign children to play the cello or join the football team. However, the research we do have is highly suggestive. Some researchers have equipped children with beepers that prompt them to report what they are doing and how they feel at random times throughout the day. When kids are in school, they report feeling challenged but not very motivated. When they are hanging out with friends, they feel motivated but not challenged. It is only when they are engaged in sports, music, or other structured activities that they report feeling both challenged and motivated. This unique combination, high challenge and high intrinsic motivation, is the breeding ground for grit. There is also a fascinating body of research known as the correspondence principle. It suggests that we gravitate toward situations that fit our personalities, but we also become more like the situations we are in. If you are a gritty kid, you are more likely to join the track team. But being on the track team, waking up early, running laps, pushing through pain, also makes you grittier. So, does participation in these activities actually predict success? To answer this, I looked at the Grit Grid, a tool used by college admissions officers to evaluate applicants' extracurricular involvement. The Grid Awards points not just for participation, but for sustained participation and advancement. I analyzed data from thousands of high school students and found that those with a history of continuous commitment to a specific activity were far more likely to graduate from college and achieve professional success. It wasn't just about being well-rounded, doing a little bit of everything. It was about being pointy, having a clear, sustained passion. Specifically, I found that students who devoted more than a year to an activity were significantly grittier than those who dabbled, and those who devoted more than 2 years were even grittier. This led me to a simple rule for my own family. We call it the hard thing rule. It has 3 parts. Everyone has to do a hard thing. This applies to me and my husband too. A hard thing is something that requires daily, deliberate practice. For me, it's psychological research and yoga. For my husband, it's real estate development and running. For my eldest daughter, Amanda, it's piano. You can quit, but you can't quit on a bad day. You can't quit because the teacher yelled at you, or because you lost a race, or because you're tired. You must finish the season, the tuition period, or the commitment interval you agreed to. You must honor your commitment. You get to pick your hard thing. Nobody picks it for you. It has to be something you're at least vaguely interested in. Lucy, the daughter who was once defeated by a raisin box, cycled through half a dozen hard things. She tried ballet, gymnastics, track, handicrafts, and piano. She started each with enthusiasm and eventually decided she didn't want to continue, but she finished what she started. Finally, she landed on the viola. She has been at it for 3 years now, and her interest has only grown. Next year, when Amanda enters high school, we will add a 4th part to the rule. You must commit to at least one activity for at least 2 years. This might sound strict, but my daughters don't see it that way. They understand that grit takes practice. They know that to get good at something, you have to stick with it through the hard parts. The playing fields of grit are where we learn that we can do hard things. They are where we learn that frustration is not a signal to stop, but a signal to try harder. They are where we learn that we are capable of more than we think. Chapter 12. The first football game I ever watched from start to finish was Super Bowl Exulvate. It was February 2nd, 2014, and the Seattle Seahawks obliterated the Denver Broncos, 43-8. The next day, head coach Pete Carroll was interviewed. The reporter asked, "What does it mean to be a Seahawk?" Pete chuckled and said, "I will tell you that we're looking for great competitors, guys that really have grit, the mindset that they're always going to succeed, that they've got something to prove. We really refer to it as grit." I wasn't surprised. 9 months earlier, Pete had called me. He had just watched my TED talk, and he was agitated. He was annoyed because I had ended my talk by admitting that science didn't yet know how to build grit. Pete practically yelled at his screen, "Building grit is exactly what the Seahawks culture is all about." So I went to Seattle to see for myself. What I found was a culture designed intentionally and meticulously to cultivate grit. Culture is often invisible. It is the air we breathe. It is the shared norms and values of a group, but its power is immense. If you want to be gritty, find a gritty culture and join it. If you want to become a great swimmer, join a great team. This is the correspondence principle in action again. We are social creatures. We conform to the group. If you are surrounded by people who wake up at 4 a.m. to practice, who never complain, who strive for excellence in every detail, you will soon do the same. Not because you are forced to, but because you want to belong. At the Seahawks facility, everything is about competition and excellence. But it's not a cutthroat, dog-eat-dog environment. It is a culture of support. Pete Carroll runs his team with a philosophy he calls always compete. But he defines competition differently than most. It's not about beating others, it's about striving to be your best self. It is an internal battle. He also preaches finish. In practice, players don't just run the play, they run through the whistle, they finish every drill, they finish every rep. They are training the habit of finishing, but perhaps the most surprising element of the Seahawks culture is love. Yes, love. One of their mantras is Elob, love our brothers. Pete believes that you cannot ask a player to push himself to the limit if he doesn't feel supported. He treats his players like his own children. He is demanding, yes, but he is also incredibly warm. He is a wise parent to 53 grown men. During my visit, a player asked me what to do about his little brother, whose grades were slipping. He had bought him an Xbox as a reward for good grades, but it wasn't working. Should I just give him the Xbox? He asked. Before I could answer, Pete jumped in. First of all, there is absolutely no way you give that game to your brother. You got him motivated. That's a start. But now what? He needs some coaching. He needs a plan. He needs your help in figuring out those next steps. This moment crystallized the Seahawks culture for me. It is about high standards. No Xbox for bad grades, combined with high support. He needs your help. This culture of grit isn't limited to football. I visited West Point again. I talked to the generals. They told me that the culture of the academy is designed to break you down and then build you back up. But crucially, they build you back up together. The cadets who survive Beast Barracks rely on each other. They learn that they cannot succeed alone. I visited the KIPP schools, a network of charter schools serving low-income students. Their motto is work hard, be nice. They talk about grit explicitly, they teach it, they celebrate it. When a student struggles, the message isn't, you're not smart enough. The message is, you're not working hard enough yet. The bottom line is this. If you want to be grittier, find a gritty culture and join it. If you are a leader, a parent, or a coach, build a gritty culture. How? Select for grit. Pete Carroll looks for great competitors. KIPP looks for teachers who have overcome adversity. Define the culture. Have a clear philosophy. Always compete. Work hard. Be nice. Language matters. Use the language of grit. Talk about finishing, persevering, overcoming, enforce the norms. It's not enough to have a motto on the wall. You have to live it. If the rule is be early, you have to call people out when they are late. Love your people. Grit flourishes in an environment of high support. You have to care about the people you are leading. As I left the Seahawks facility, I looked up. Above the door in foot-high chrome letters was the word character, and in my hand I held a blue rubber bracelet stamped with L.O.B. Love our brothers. Chapter 13. This book has been my attempt to take you out for a coffee and tell you everything I know about grit. It has been about the power of passion and perseverance to help you achieve your potential. I wrote it because I believe, with every fiber of my being, that what we accomplish in the marathon of life depends tremendously on our grit. An obsession with talent distracts us from that simple truth. I'm almost done, but before I go, let me leave you with a few final thoughts. The first is that you can grow your grit. I have told you about the inside-out approach, how you can cultivate your own interests, develop a habit of daily deliberate practice, connect your work to a purpose beyond yourself, and learn to hope when all seems lost. I've also told you about the outside-in approach, how parents, coaches, teachers, and bosses can create environments that demand high standards while providing high support. I've told you about the playing fields of grit, the extracurriculars that teach us to finish what we start. And I have told you about the power of culture, of joining a team where grit is the norm. But there is a question I haven't fully answered. Is it possible to have too much grit? Sometimes people ask me if grit is the only thing that matters. They worry that a single-minded focus on a goal might make someone narrow, boring, or even unethical. Let me be clear. Grit is not the only thing that matters. There are many other character strengths that are just as important, if not more so. In my lab, we study a whole range of character strengths, and we group them into 3 clusters. Intrapersonal character. This includes grit, self-control, and optimism. These are the strengths of will. They help you achieve your own goals. Interpersonal character. This includes gratitude, social intelligence, and self-control over anger. These are the strengths of heart. They help you get along with other people. Intellectual character. This includes curiosity and zest. These are the strengths of mind. They help you engage with ideas. Grit is a powerhouse for achievement. If you want to win a gold medal, write a novel, or start a business, you need intrapersonal strength. But if you want to be a good friend, a loving partner, or a contributing member of your community, you need interpersonal strength. And if you want to be a lifelong learner, you need intellectual strength. I want my daughters to be gritty. I want them to be able to do hard things, but I also want them to be kind. I want them to be curious. I want them to be happy. If I had to choose, I would rather they be kind than gritty. But the good news is, we don't have to choose. We can be both. The second thought I want to leave you with is about happiness. When I talk about the grind of deliberate practice, the frustration, the fatigue, the sacrifice, people often assume that gritty people must be miserable. They picture a life of grim determination, void of joy. But the data says otherwise. My research shows that gritty people are actually happier than others. They have higher life satisfaction, they feel a greater sense of purpose, they are more likely to be in a state of flow. Why? Because human beings are built to strive. We are not built to sit on the couch and watch TV all day. We are built to pursue goals that matter to us. We are built to overcome challenges. There is a deep, abiding satisfaction in doing something well. There is joy in the pursuit of excellence. Finally, I want to talk about genius. We started this book with my father's obsession with genius. He believed that genius was a birthright, a magical gift bestowed upon a lucky few. He believed that without it, you were destined for mediocrity. He was wrong. Genius is not a fixed entity. It is not a binary label. You have it or you don't. Genius is something you build. When you look at the most accomplished people in history, the Darwins, the Michael Phelpses, the writers and artists and scientists who changed the world, you see talent, yes, but you also see a ferocity of effort that is almost terrifying. You see years of mundane, unsexy, exhausting practice. You see failure after failure. You see a refusal to give up. If we define genius as great accomplishment, then grit is a necessary component of genius. So, if you ever find yourself worrying that you aren't talented enough, or smart enough, or gifted enough, remember this: talent is common, grit is rare, but grit is not fixed. You can grow it. You can start today. You can find something that interests you. You can practice it until it hurts. You can connect it to a purpose. You can hope. You can join a gritty culture. And if you do that, if you stay loyal to your goal, if you get up when you fall, if you refuse to settle for good enough, then you might just find that you have become a genius after all. My father never did call me a genius, but he did read this book. And when he finished, he smiled. That was enough for me.